What's up, guys, and welcome to the Rebalance podcast, where we dive into topics that matter most when it comes to overcoming struggles, injuries, and finding balance in your life. Everybody's idea of balance is that bit different, so my goal is to give you different perspectives, practical tips, as well as expert insights into what it means to live a balanced life. My name is Robbie Cassidy. I'm a physiotherapist and a health coach, and I've been helping people reignite their love for challenge, overcome their fear, and find more balance in their life through the process of self-development. So, let's get into it. What's up, guys, and welcome back to the podcast. This episode of the podcast, we are going to look at plyometrics, and we're going to look at them in a rehab scenario specifically, as opposed to diving into plyometrics as what many of you know them in like a sporting situation. Now, I'm going to use them, I'm going to try to apply them to rehab when I would use them in the case of like an acute, a chronic injury, or like even a tendinopathy. In a lot of cases, tendinopathy is obviously a chronic injury, but it's not like the general chronic injury that we talk about. So I want to just try apply it, give you a couple of ideas of when to use them at different stages, how you can incorporate them, and then different exercises that you can use to build them up, and over time then to hopefully use them as an injury prevention method. Now, this was actually a recommendation, or it was somebody asked me would I do a podcast on plyometrics, so I said I would cover it from my perspective of it when I use it most, and then hopefully it gives you a better idea of how you can incorporate them into your own training. As always, I try to give you practical tips that you can use and that you can work into your own rehab and your own training sessions, and this episode will be no different. So, to jump right into it, what is a plyometric? A plyometric is an exercise that really involves repeated rapid stretching or contracting of the muscles. So if you're either jumping, bounding, throwing, any type of explosive movement is really a plyometric in a lot of ways. And the idea is you want to increase muscle power and explosiveness. So as I was saying, when you're doing box jumps, are probably the most common one that people know. Otherwise, you have like bounding, skipping, sprinting. It would be a type plyometric, but wouldn't be like what you would also include as a plyometric. It's more isolated exercises as what I would look at them, and skipping in terms of like what kids do, skipping, and then skipping as in skipping rope. So as I go into it, I'll hopefully be able to give you ideas of different ones that you can use and when to use them in different situations. So to jump in, the importance of plyometrics in rehab, well, first off, they're really effective for both muscle and joint injuries, whether that be an acute injury or a chronic one. And the reason being is because it's any activity that you do, unless you're playing chess, in a lot of cases, you have some form of explosive activity in it. And when you injure a muscle, or if you injure a joint, people often miss out on the explosive side of their rehab because they're too focused on the strengthening side, which is really important. But we need to think that the majority of these injuries happen when you're going through an explosive movement, and as a result, if you're not incorporating that into your rehab, explosive movements are a lot more than just the muscle contracting explosively. There's a lot of proprioception coordination involved in that as well, and if we're not training those and we're not incorporating those in the likes of plyometrics, well, you're leaving out a specific part of your training that will affect your performance when you go back, and at the same time it leaves you kind of a gap that you may get injured in that case again. With injury prevention, it's always a difficult one to talk about because it's something that you can do your best, but there's a lot of injuries that are just, you won't be able to prevent them. They're just difficult to prevent. But I still think that you should set yourself up as best as you can to try to prevent any injury. And that's why we train, that's why we go to the gym, that's why we manage load, that's why we manage sleep. We know a lot of things that are going to contribute to it. So in another case, this is why I always package plyometrics in my rehab plans, because it's so important. And when you're looking at a muscle and joint injury, as I said, you need to consider the type of injury and when it happened. So did it happen during a sharp movement? Did you tear a hamstring, let's say, when you were sprinting? The interesting thing with hamstring injuries is the majority of them happen, and if anyone's interested, I did a podcast on this very recently. The majority of hamstring injuries actually happen during deceleration. So it's when you speed up, you're sprinting for something, and then if you're going to slow yourself down. So like if somebody goes to sidestep you in a pitch. That's the majority of hamstring injuries happen during that deceleration phase. So we need to be able to control ourselves in that phase. And if we don't get good at the deceleration phase, we can do all the strength and power in the world, but we're not taking care of the highest risk, the most important part. It's the same thing with ACL injuries. 75% of non-contact ones happen in the last 15 minutes of a game. So obviously we know that this fatigue plays a huge role in that then. So if we're not training under fatigue mechanics, we're not taking care of the most important thing. And that's what we're always looking at with rehab, is like ticking off the most important things first, and then you're obviously filling in all the gaps around that after. So when you look at this, is like, when did the injury happen? Then you get an understanding of how you can start to incorporate the movements that you need to into your rehab. It's as simple as that. And it's also a really good way, plyometrics are, what I mean, a really good way of controlling chaos as you go through your phases. So as you progress through your phases, as you get better at them, you don't want to go straight from the gym, where you're just in the gym, onto the pitch, where you're out and you're sprinting and you're moving around. Because the issue with that is that it's a lot more chaos. You can do that, obviously, there's no problem with it as long as you control the movements that you're doing out there. But the plyometrics help you to bring this idea of chaos, and chaos is like where it's more uncontrolled body weight. That's a simple variation or simple idea of chaos. And plyometrics are a really good way of introducing that in a gym setting, because the body then starts to get used of, okay, everything isn't just perfect alignment where I'm going through a perfect squat or I'm going through a perfect single leg exercise. It's where I'm landing from a jump and I need to control my body weight and I need to control everything around me. So I need to maybe catch a ball, and I'll talk about that as we go through it with the dual tasking. But the plyometrics are a great way of building up to that. And now the other thing is, when you're looking at a tendinopathy, which is like an overuse injury, it's a good way of building tissue integrity and tissue tolerance. What I always tell people is, for your Achilles, let's say, Achilles tendinopathies, a really simple way of prehabbing an Achilles so you are less likely to get an Achilles tendinopathy is just include something simple like skipping rope into your sessions. Because it's a low level plyometric, but it's building that tissue integrity. It's getting it use of the rebound. It's getting the use of taking contact. It's getting the actual tendon used of being able to contract and relax. And as a result then, when you go out, sometimes you'll notice that the tendon is able to tolerate a lot more, as long as the other side of it is you actually get a lot more explosive with it as well. So I always tell people to, when you're looking at an Achilles injury, try to include a bit of skipping when possible in your prehab phases and then in the rehab phases as well. But we won't get into that too much right now, because I don't want to focus on one specific injury. I want to talk about plyometrics as a whole. Now, it's also really good for chronic injuries. Now, chronic injury is something that keeps coming back. Let's say you've had the same injury for over 3 months. This can be like a back flare-up, a knee flare-up, hip flare-up, shoulder, anything, a lot of those areas that just kind of come and go. The reason plyometrics are good here, because it builds confidence in your body and it builds confidence in your nervous system, as well as control in your nervous system around a certain joint. Because as we know, muscles never work by themselves. They never really work in isolation. They're always working with other ones, because they need to stabilize joints, so they need to move joints. They need to move bones, I should say. Now, if we do that, if we start to include those plyometrics, what we're doing is we're making them work in a certain way. We're making all the muscles co-contract in a way so that they can do it most efficiently, because your body there's nothing better than your body to figure out a way to make it more efficient. And using these low-level plyometrics at the start and then building them up over time is a way of introducing that at a nice, easy level, and then improving that coordination over time. And as a result, when you start to improve coordination, you start to improve your confidence. And that's a huge part with these chronic injuries. You'll always hear me talk about it. It's confidence, confidence, confidence. If the nervous system is not confident, it will give you a lot more pain. It will give you a lot more tightness in the area. If it is confident, it won't give you as much, because it doesn't feel like it needs to protect it. I'm not talking about confidence as much as like people walking around with your chest out like McGregor confidence. I'm talking about literal nervous system confidence in how the amount of range it gives you, what it lets you do with that joint, what it lets you do with your body, because it feels that it's able to, if it goes into a position, it feels that it'll be able to come out of it. That's the type of confidence that I'm talking about. For chronic injuries also, what it does is, as I was saying, often you'll find that flare-ups happen with explosive movements. So people will say that I went down, or I was picking something off the ground and my back flared up when I went to stand up straight again. Now, there's a lot more involved in that. There's a lot more, and a lot of that is actually psychological as well. And I talk about that in other podcasts, so I won't dive into that too deeply. But it's those explosive movements that people may not have done for a while, especially after an extended period of rest, that we need to really start to, if you can include plyometrics, you can look to improve your ability to tolerate those movements. What's up, guys? Robbie here. I hope you are enjoying the podcast so far. I want to take a moment just to personally ask you for your help. If you're enjoying the podcast, would you be willing to share it with someone you think would love it too? Maybe a friend, family member on social media, or even if you just brought it up in conversation with someone you know. The recommendation means the world to us, and it's because of people like you that we get to be able to produce this podcast on a weekly basis. So thank you so much for your support so far, and I would love if you could help us reach even more people who could benefit from it too. Really appreciate you, and we're going to jump straight back to the podcast. Now, looking at the phases of when to use plyometrics, we need to look at early, middle, late stage, and we also need to look at like rehab prevention afterwards. Now that can be in both, but I want to include also in that phase is your performance side of things. So the early stage, you're looking at very low level plyometrics. With the lower body, you may be looking at something like a skip and rope, where you're just using a skip and rope and you're going for maybe 30 seconds at a time, if you're able to do that. Some people can't do that. If you can't do it with a skip and rope, you can just do it by like little bounces. Really, really good for early stage ankle rehab, knee rehab, hip, lower back, anything lower limb. It's an excellent way of building that up. It's also very good for your muscles, but what we have to understand is in the early stages of a muscle tear and a joint injury, obviously in the very early stages, you're still at higher risk to increase the severity of that injury by doing too much too fast. So that's what we need to watch, is like everything has to be very low level, and plyometrics are going to be a way that if you use them right, you can speed up the recovery, you can really aid it. But if you do it wrong and you do too much too fast, you're obviously going to injure it more. And that's just the way it is, because it's an explosive movement and it's less controlled. So I always say early stage, keep it low level. Things like skip and rope, things like bounding on the spot where you're doing like little skips, or you could do like little hops. I wouldn't be doing anything too crazy that you're dual tasking or anything that you're trying to do two things at the same time. Generally, I wouldn't be looking at box jumps too early, because obviously depending on the height of the box makes a big difference, but it's a lot more like there's a lot more variables there that you need to be careful of. And I think for some people, it's probably when you're doing these things by yourself, it's not the best option to be doing loads of heavy explosive movements. So anyway, I should say always do this in line with your physio. Really important to consult a medical professional as you do this, because they're a healthcare professional as well, because these things, you don't want to injure yourself anymore. But if you're just working by yourself and you're looking for little ideas, these things can work. Early stage, as I said, low level, basic. You're just looking at reintroducing the movement more so than really building up loads of reps on the movement. So for people, it could be, if you like, for me, I put up a video on Instagram when I sprained my ankle recently that I started, it should be last year, actually, it wouldn't be recently, but I started out with single leg hops the same day that I actually sprained my ankle. Now, it wasn't a severe sprain, it was more of a grade 1 sprain, but I wanted to see what type of movement I had in it. And the goal was to just basically get it moving very lightly, like very, very, very lightly. And it was more to see if I could get up on my toe. And what that did then is it gave me a better idea of what the damage was. And I started doing those straight away. I looked to increase it each day, then I was increasing it more and more. I actually had to get into like a fight at the end of the week, the next week. So I had 10 days, I think, to get it right. So I had to really work on it a lot. And what I did with that was every single day, I started doing my little hops. Then I looked at how can I make it a small bit harder by increasing the challenge. Easiest way to do that was close my eyes, hop on different surfaces, hop going forward and coming backwards, hopping left to right, changing feet. Okay, I wasn't doing anything too explosive, but I was just keeping it low level and just changing the input at the same time. And it's a really simple one. I have that video, just check out my Instagram if you want to see that. But ease into it. Early stage, you have to ease into it. The middle stage, now I'm using these as like early stage, middle stage, late stage. It's going to really depend. If you have like an ACL injury, your early stage, middle stage and late stage is going to be extended over a year-long process. It's an ankle injury, it could be over a couple of weeks. So it's more general here when I'm talking about these. But the middle stage, you're looking at, you already have a good tolerance built up in it to exercise in general and strengthening and movements. And what you're looking at is starting to incorporate more explosive exercise to test the durability of it. That's the middle stage for me, what I always look at doing. For lower limb, you're looking at like triple hops, broad jumps, counter movement jumps. You could start to introduce things like a box jump then at a lower level. But you need to focus on building up the tolerance first. Then you're looking to build up the durability. And you do that by managing your intensity and your volume. So your volume is, do you do 3 sets of 15 or 3 sets of 20, or do you do 1 set of 40? That's how you mess with your volume and your intensity. Intensity then is like, how explosive are you doing it? Are you doing it like loads and loads and loads of times throughout the day? Are you going to do it to like a high box? What intensity is obviously the intensity of it. That's the next thing that you need to look at. And as I said, when you're looking at this aspect of it, you could probably break the middle stage down into another couple of blocks, but you would generally start to include dual tasking. Dual tasking is like if you're hopping on a leg and you're catching a ball or hand passing a ball off a wall, or you might be going through like a more of a obstacle course where you're running up, you're jumping left or right, you're doing a couple of different things at the same time, but it's still in a very controlled environment. That's the idea of it. And what you can do also, this is a thing that I think a lot of people miss out on, and you could really pick up, you could speed up your recovery so fast with this, is that if you add in the exercises at the end of your training sessions, anyone I work with, I'm looking to get them back to training as early as possible, and then we can manage it around that. Because a lot of times, once you get back, you might not be able to jump into the full training, but you can do little bits and pieces. And when you are stepping out of the training, when you've the little pieces done that you could do, and you step out of the training, then you can start to increase it a small bit more, where you do your jumps and your explosive exercises outside of it, where they're a bit more controlled and you're doing them on a fatigued body. That's where you get into kind of the semantics of it. That's where you get into the details, really. But if you do focus on that, and you're looking at just upping the tolerance as much as you can and starting to include more explosive exercises to make it more durable, that is the goal of the middle stage. Now, late stage, you're looking at, you've already shown a proficiency in your ability to tolerate explosive activities. So you have done lots of different explosive activities. You've included them with dual tasking. You're probably looking at late stage. It's like when you're back at training and the movements that you're doing. Really easy example would be if you were like a rugby player, it would be that you were like taking tackles. You weren't good jumping into full trainings like 100%, but you were still jumping into a couple every once in a while. You were maybe practicing side steps with an opponent, or an opponent sidestepping you. That idea, where it's a bit more uncontrolled, a bit more chaos, but still manageable at the time. Now that's your late stage. Now the other side of the late stage is you can really up the amount that you're doing, where you're repeating your jumps. As I was saying before, if you were doing 3 sets at the late stage, you might be doing 4 or 5 sets just to get more out of it. So you have to manage it. It's always coming back to a nice interplay of like the amount of volume, the amount of intensity, how your body's reacting, the pain that you're getting, the stiffness that you're getting after it, what you're doing together. So dual tasking, are you able to catch a ball and pass it while you're standing on one leg? Or are you able to jump off a box, land, take a tackle, do a few different things like that at the same time? That's really, really important when you're looking at late stage stuff. It's really returning to sport side of your rehab phase, and returning to full sport as opposed to just basic sport. That full sport, I mean full contact, as opposed to just where you're in a controlled environment. That's huge. If we can get an understanding of those different stages, you'll see that your rehab will improve way faster. And lastly then, we are looking at your prehab or your performance side of things. Now your prehab, your performance, if you've had an injury, you should be always continuing on, doing bits and pieces on it afterwards, making sure you manage your load around that injury just to make sure that you don't cause it to kick up again, or you reduce the likelihood that it happens again. But when you're looking at the prehab and performance, I will always say continue to focus on building up a tolerance, whether that be volume or intensity, to a certain stage. Now, with prehab, the art of it, or the game of it in a lot of ways, is that you don't want to, like if you're training on a Friday night, you don't want to just try blast out a lot of skipping on a Thursday night to try to keep the Achilles away, because you're obviously fatiguing it, and you're too much load too fast is going to cause it to kick up more. So with the prehab phase, you're managing it throughout the week as well, and you're just adding in a few exercises here and there just to make sure that it's ticking over. The other thing is, as I said earlier on, there's nothing wrong with having your high days high, in terms of if you have a training session on a Friday night, afterwards, after that training session, actually doing a few exercises when you're fatigued as prehab. and just having that as your prehab focus for the week. I think a lot of people, that's going to become more popular in time. A lot of people haven't really caught on to that yet, that I've noticed. Even a lot of professional sports teams, I see they don't do that enough. If you do that, it's a simple way of just getting in the exercises that you need, making sure that you're having a high day and then taking the next day or two off as like lower days, where you're not trying to fit in loads on your lower days because you feel that you're falling behind. So that's the idea with your prehab performance. Now, the other thing is that really simple thing to do as well is that if you have a lift, this is this idea of post-activation potentiation. I know someone was asking me about this, so I said I better throw it in really quickly. You can also incorporate your plyometrics after a heavy lift in the gym. So if you do like a heavy squat, your box jump right after that squat is going to be a lot more powerful. So to double down on the prehab side of things, do your heavy squat and then do your box jumps after. And they tie in very well together. You get more explosion out of it. And as a result, then you're working on the performance side and the prehab together. So that's a simple one. But as always, you're trying to mix it around. You're finding what works for you. Lastly on this, if you haven't a lot of plyometrics done before and you're middle of the season right now, I wouldn't be too keen on adding a load of plyometrics right now, because the explosive nature of it, as I said, it can cause issues to kick up a bit earlier, and you don't want to be having that problem when it doesn't need to be there. So that's just make sure that if you're in season, you're not going to add a load of lots and lots of plyometrics to your programming right now if you haven't it done before, because you don't want to be kicking up with something silly that you didn't need to have early on. And I've seen it happen to loads of people where they've done nothing and they've watched the video and they said, geez, those exercises look really good on Instagram, and then they do them and they're sitting out then for 2 weeks because they're after causing their patellar tendon to flare up or your Achilles tendon to flare up. So if we can avoid that, all the better. But that's all I'm going to talk about today. Trying to keep it short and sweet. Hopefully touched on all of the topics there that we needed to touch on. And would love to actually get on a guy in future who is a plyometrics expert for the strength and conditioning side of things a bit more, so you can go into the performance side of it. But that's all I'm going to chat about today. If anyone hasn't yet listened to, I've put out a podcast recently on chronic back pain. If you or anyone you know deals with back pain, I would definitely check that out. We go into a lot of detail, and I also, for anyone who is dealing with any type of a pain or recurring pain, to check out the book or the free email guide that I have. It's more of a guide. It's only 1,500 words. It takes about 15 minutes to read it. So it's definitely worth reading if you're interested in this side of things. If you're interested in physio, if you're interested in injuries and why random injuries kick up at different times, why your shoulder gets sore, why your neck gets sore, why an old injury you had 15 years ago starts to flare up again. It's called Understanding the Root Cause of Chronic Pain. Chronic pain, recurring pain, persistent pain, just any issue that keeps kicking up, it was the goal of that. Check it out. If you go into the bottom of this podcast, the description of this podcast, there'll be a link there. You can download it for free, and you get to learn about why it happens as well as how you can fix it. If anyone has any questions or needs anything, just get on to me on Instagram. But that's all from me, and Instagram is @themobilityjitter. That is all from me. Hopefully you are all doing well, and I will chat to you all again next week. Have a good one. Okay guys, thank you so much for listening to today's podcast. I hope you enjoyed the show. If you're looking to learn more about what we do, as well as check out any of the mobility and prehab programs we have available, just head over to the description of this podcast and you will find a link to all the programs there. As always, thank you for listening, and I will chat to you all again in the next episode. Have a good one.